Hi, everybody. So the first half of the lecture went on a lot longer than I thought it was going to, and I do apologize for that. This class is still something that I'm working out the kinks of in terms of teaching this online. This half will be much shorter because there is a bit less to say about the human presence in Antarctica, but there's still some pretty interesting stuff to say. This half of the lecture, lecture 2B, will kind of serve as an introduction to it will serve as an introduction to the the human history of Antarctica that we'll get to more in the second half of the class. And also, it'll give you a sense of what's actually going on in Antarctica and where the science is coming from. So, Antarctica has a population of 0. There's no permanent population there. It has never had an indigenous population of any kind. There's all that art that shows Arctic people hunting penguins, and that just kind of feels like the Flintstones to me, frankly. There are going to be at most 5,000 people-ish on the continent in the summer if you have a lot of research going on. In the winter, it's going to be just about 1,000. So not a big population at any point in the year. The people there are going to be scientists, or they're going to be the support staff. You've had a lot of other people go there in the past, but unless you're a scientist, a support staff, or one of the tourists making a brief stay, you are not going to get to Antarctica. One fun fact is that they have actually had some people born south of the Antarctic Circle. All have been born at the Esperanza base, the Argentinian base, or Montalvo base. And those two bases have a lot of cases where scientists will come for 2 or 3 year stints, and they bring their families with them. And there are now actually small schools at both of them for raising the small number of children who come there with their parents or who might be born there and need nursery school. Most stations don't allow this, so not a lot of children get to see Antarctica. But Antarctica is kind of not really, doesn't have a single country on it. There's no capital cities in Antarctica. There's no real cities. There's just the research bases. Now, a number of countries, mostly European and South American, Australia and New Zealand do as well. The US does not have one. They claim bits of Antarctica based on sectors, these sectors going from the South Pole, kind of like on a pie chart. These maps, we'll talk more about how these claims came to be during the history of Antarctica, but for now, what you need to know is that they're rendered void by the Antarctic Treaty. All of these nations signed the Antarctic Treaty saying that they can do research here, but that no one's really going to take your claims that seriously. You can't mine in them, you can't build military bases, and it also means that you can't say, oh, I'm only going to let my scientists work here. The United States base is actually McMurdo base is inside of the New Zealand claim, or Ross dependency. There is part of Antarctica that is unclaimed, and it is what you call terra nullius, which means that nobody claims it. There is only one other example on Earth. It is a bizarre little example on the Egypt-Sudan border, where both countries, the boundaries were drawn differently. Both countries claim what's called the Habaib Triangle over here, but each map kind of puts this other little desert area known as Bir Tawil in the other version. So basically, each country wants this area but doesn't want this area, so nobody claims Bir Tawil. It is a very bizarre, and it's bizarre. Nobody lives there. It's desert. An American citizen once tried to claim himself king of it. He visited it, put a flag there, and claimed his daughter was the princess, and mostly people just laughed because A, Americans, B, honestly, it's like, what the heck? But honestly, some of the stories of the people who tried to go to Antarctica later kind of remind me of this. The settlements in Antarctica presently are the bases. The largest by far is McMurdo Base, which can have a summer population of up to 1,000 people, possibly even 1,500 people if you have tourists there during the summer. That drops to 200-ish people in the winter. McMurdo is over here. It is very close to Scott Base, the New Zealand base. You'll notice that most bases are not that close to each other. The Vostok Russian base is very far from anything else. Also, the US bases are not particularly close to each other. We have one at McMurdo, one at the South Pole, and one on the peninsula. And it's not just countries that have territorial claims that have bases now. We do not have the United States does not have a territorial claim, but we have several bases and have one of the larger Antarctic research presences currently. Our 3 bases are Palmer Base in the Antarctic Peninsula, and named after Commander Nathaniel Palmer, who is a prominent figure in Antarctic exploration. The United States also tried to call the Antarctic Peninsula the Palmer Peninsula at one point, and that has not stuck. I like Antarctic Peninsula better. It's like it's Antarctica. Let's not Americanize it. But it is a tiny, tiny base. I'll have a brief slide showing you what kind of stuff is there. There is also the base at the South Pole, Amundsen Scott, named after the two men who would undergo the race to the South Pole that we'll learn about later. One of them didn't make it back, really. And then McMurdo. And then these other dots are other country stations. And we will talk a little bit about other country stations, just a couple of examples. I wish we had time to go over more of them. But ask me if you're curious about anything, and also you're very free to write about the Antarctic bases for one of your reading assignments if you are curious to see what goes on outside of just the US bases. I try not to make this horribly United States centric, but I am an American girl and I'm teaching in the US, so some of that's going to happen. Anyway, so McMurdo Base has heated dormitories, which I only got to experience for a couple weeks. It actually has like pizza and other kind of just fancier food in general than you would expect to have in Antarctica. They actually brought us pizza once in the field. Damien here, my field mate, requested they bring us pizza once when a helicopter had to run back to do a repair, basically. And they actually brought us pizza. It was cold, but it was still delicious. There are saunas, which is really nice. There's a gymnasium. There's bars. There is a post office. There are the 2 ATMs, the only ones on the continent. And it essentially looks like a large mining camp. It has a lot of the heavy equipment needed to support life in the field. It's where helicopters are based. It's where planes fly from. A lot of the people who are based at other stations end up flying through McMurdo because it has larger facilities than, say, does Ross Station, the close by but much smaller New Zealand base. And some research does occur at McMurdo, but it's essentially base command. It's essentially base camp. And we were within flying distance from McMurdo, a couple hours helicopter ride from it, and within radio contact of them. So they were mission control while we were there, basically. Now, I was a scientist there, and McMurdo exists in the first place to enable science, but the people there are mostly kind of just regular people in a sense. People driving trucks. My friend Julie, who was a dishwasher there, and I actually met her because I have a mutual friend who knows her through a birding group. So this friend ended up knowing 2 people at Antarctica, which is kind of funny. Helicopter pilots and techs, priests, hairdressers, not necessarily a lot of each of those, but you have a small town there, essentially. You have a small town to make this function as close as possible to a functioning town. Because if you're on base doing science, obviously if you're going out in the field, it's a different story, but they've created as close as there can be to like an actual town in Antarctica as there will be. And that's one reason I like showing some of the clips that I'm planning on assigning, that I have assigned for you later in the term, because some of those documentaries do a really nice job of interviewing just the people who end up working here, as opposed to the people who have scientific grants. And I'm a scientist, obviously. I think the science is cool, but I think it's really, the scientists down there, the scientists do not always do enough to acknowledge just how much work the other staff at McMurdo do, or at any other Antarctic base. And so I try to do my best to emphasize just how nothing would happen down there if there weren't a small army of people washing our dishes and flying our helicopters and refueling us and calling us to make sure that we're alive, and etc. McMurdo Base is within walking distance of the small New Zealand base, Scott Base. That is not to be confused with Amundsen Scott Base. I find that excruciatingly confusing. But Scott Base is much smaller and functions. It looks more like a little camp than a big camp. Basically, it looks like a little. I don't know, like a refuel facility, like a tiny one. McMurdo is also near some cool Antarctic artifacts, like this. So it's named Scott after the same guy, Robert Falcon Scott, who landed here several times and would depart for his voyage to the South Pole from the area that is now McMurdo Base. However, he would not survive the attempt. There is a cross at McMurdo Base erected in his memory. His survival hut from one of his journeys is also still there. You can't go in it, but you can walk up right next to it. It has been preserved in remarkably good shape because it is so cold and nothing decomposes in the Antarctic. Now, this is what McMurdo looks like from above. You can see the tiny, tiny Scott base is over here, and then this monstrosity is McMurdo Base. Kind of hard to tell, but this is the dock. This is actually the ocean, and this is what I mean when I say that icebreakers have to come through. This is pretty early in the summer before it's thawed up much, but the ice is still pretty hard to break through. If any of you saw the seals in my previous slide, that's because they were there because the ice had started to break up and because the icebreakers had begun leaving open water for them. The seals really like McMurdo because the icebreakers break the ice open for them, and that gives them more breathing holes and gives them more opportunities to dive down and go after fish. Penguins don't love it for this reason. The penguins don't want to be near here because the open water attracts lots of leopard seals, and they know it, and they don't really want to go near it. Occasionally, they will get vagrant penguins near there, but not very many. And McMurdo really does kind of function like a small city. I mentioned there's a music festival. People do what they can to try to make it into as reasonably close to your life off continent as you can, even though living in Antarctica really is just like living nowhere else. It's not even quite the same as being in outer space, honestly. Not that I've been to outer space, but it's an analogy that I make a lot. But it's not quite the same. It's just a very unique place, and it's difficult to describe. It's difficult to describe. It's also hard to like put it in terms beyond just like I kind of had this. It just felt different, but I'm rambling a little bit. Moving a little bit on from McMurdo, one station I have not been to, but that several UCSB-based researchers have been to, including Alex Sims, who sometimes teaches this class and has taken some of his grad students there. Palmer Station, the Antarctic Peninsula base station, which kind of just looks like a small fishing village. If it looks like a fishing hamlet. There's only actually about 20 to 30 support staff during the summer, and it's much more Spartan and bare bones than McMurdo. You have some scientists doing research there, doing climatology research, marine mammal research, ocean research. The main purpose of Palmer, though, is as a docking point for the research vessels. If you look closely, you can see this logo on this map. I don't know what you'd call this exactly, but this upsticking part of the ship. That is the U.S. Antarctic Program logo. The United States has 2 government vessels that are used as floating laboratories. Hundreds of scientists and support staff live and work on these ships doing research on ocean sediments, glaciers, ocean water, marine wildlife. Some of the scientists at UCSB who went on these vessels kind of used them as a ferry ride more than anything. They flew to they took a boat from Chile to Palmer Station, and then took one of the research vessels to the smaller islands where they were doing their research and also camping for multiple weeks. And they're floating laboratories, basically. Further inland, way, way, way far from the ocean, although not as far as some places, is Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. It is located at the southernmost point on Earth, and it was built as part of a concerted effort to establish a laboratory in the interior of the continent. Because until the station was built, there were no stations in the center of the continent. It was the first research station built away from the coast. The Navy actually built it. Navy Seabees constructed it during the International Geophysical Year, a concept we'll come back to, but it was a year in which several countries made a concerted effort to do a lot of Antarctic research, basically. It is a fantastic place for astronomy research or for astrophysics research. You also have people because it's just so far from any pollution and there's so much snow, you have people doing other physics research like neutrino counting. There is now a road to go there. It takes 40 days to get there, and it doesn't take as long to get back because you are going downhill on the way back. Most people fly, though. The road is mostly used for transporting large cargo. The vast majority of people going to South Pole Station fly to McMurdo Base first. So that's it for the US bases. There are a lot of other stations there, and we don't really have time to go over all of them, and that's a lot to remind yourself of. One thing that I kind of get a kick out of is there was an anime series about Antarctica several years ago, and that showed the real life Japanese station, Showa Station, and when I looked it up, it's actually more or less how it looks in the anime series. So I think that's kind of cool. Um, I previously mentioned the pole of inaccessibility, and there was for a while a research station at the pole of inaccessibility, the farthest point in Antarctica from any ocean. Russia, which formerly the USSR, established a base there, and there used to be a gigantic statue of Lenin there. So this is a picture taken in like the 60s, I think. Uh, this picture is taken in the 2000s. The base is abandoned now and almost entirely covered with snow, and Vladimir Lenin's bust is now kind of all you can see of it. I think even that has been buried since then. It was just it was just way too far from any other permanent stations to be safely occupied for a long time. And the reason it was built was to a big extent to be the first person to build a station at the point of inaccessibility. It kind of turned out that it wasn't the best place for a lot of the research anyone wanted to do, so it's no longer used and completely abandoned. But there is a bust of Vladimir Lenin sticking out of the snow in the deepest part of Antarctica, which I find completely hilarious. The present Russian government, the present Russian government, the Russian Federation, has a base at Lake Vostok, the largest of the subglacial lakes that I mentioned in the previous slides. It was also founded around the same time, but it's still used. It is pretty tiny. There's going to be 30 people at their most in the summer, and it is cold. It is, remember, where the coldest temperatures ever recorded on Earth have been recorded. The air is dry. The average, I think it was meant to be 110 miles per hour, but the wind is torrential. I apologize for that little typo there. And it is very high up. It is very high up in the East Antarctic ice sheet. It's where a lot of research into extreme climates gets done, as well as a lot of astrophysics research. It has 85 continuous days of what you consider civil polar night, meaning that the sun is more than 6 degrees below the horizon and there's just no sunlight, basically. So it is, again, a great place for astronomy and astrophysics research. There's also a lot of people working there trying to learn anything they can about Lake Vostok, which, like all of the subglacial lakes in Antarctica, is hard to get to, and it's questionable whether people should really go there much. Another one that I find pretty fascinating is Halley Station, and you'll notice that a lot of the smaller stations kind of look more like spaceships or pods than towns, because they have a much smaller set of personnel, and they're designed to be more of like just a single building or a single connected set of buildings, as opposed to a town that you would walk through. Halley Station, you'll notice, is kind of on stilts. It was designed to keep the station in as little contact with the ice as possible, because if you're touching the ice, that means that you're going to lose heat to the ice. The less you touch the ice, the less heat you lose. And this station is really cool, and a lot of good research was done there for many years. However, it is built on one of the ice shelves, and they built it on the ice shelves, which, if you recall, are the extensions of the glaciers. They built them there because they assumed they were stable. Global warming is making the ice shelves less stable, and ever since 2017, they have had to leave this station unmanned because there's too much risk from the cracking ice underneath. And this brings me to another point. Climate change in Antarctica is going to affect everything, and it is already starting to affect everything. A lot of things that we might take for granted about Antarctica, such as temperatures in Antarctica, wildlife in Antarctica, that is all going to change with climate change. And we will later in the course more directly revisit some of the specific effects of anthropogenic climate change on this continent. Almost done. The very last thing I want to go over is time in Antarctica, which frankly is weird. Time zones are weird in general. You'll notice that Pakistan and India are in different timelines for political reasons, and then the United States the time zones are drawn arbitrarily. If you look at Indiana, they put the county that has Gary, Indiana, in the same time zone as Chicago, because Gary, Indiana is a suburb of Chicago, but then the rest of Indiana is in a different time zone. So time zones are a mess already. To decide to just not bring Antarctica into that mess, they decided to go off something called universal time coordinated, which is based on time measured in reference to the sun at the prime meridian. So it's basically agreed upon time. They agreed to use this in Antarctica and to define time zones in reference to universal time coordinated. You'll notice it's kind of arbitrary in Antarctica too. It's more or less based off the sectors, but then you have this is the same time zone as all of this stuff over here. McMurdo Base is down here. That's where I was. You'll notice that this sort of red, pink, stripy stuff is also at the South Pole. And that is done largely to keep the South Pole Station and McMurdo on the same time zone, which actually does make a lot of sense. I'm not saying time zones are silly or anything. It's just they are arbitrary. They're defined on what's convenient to humans. And that's kind of why they just completely thought of a different system with Antarctica, because Antarctic time is just physically, it feels, even though it's time is time, it feels different from time elsewhere. And it's hard to stay connected with the rest of the world. For one thing, the internet stinks at best, and you're just isolated. So Antarctica is kind of a microcosm of its own. Like I said, much shorter lecture. I really do apologize for the first half of the lecture for being a little bit overloaded compared to this. My kitty says good luck with everything, and also congratulations getting done with everything. The first thing that you will have due will be lab number 1, interpreting maps. The materials will go up this Friday on Gaucho Space, and then it will be due next Friday. Remember that all due dates refer to 11:59 p.m. And please send me emails if you have trouble, but also come to discussion sessions. I'm very happy to elaborate on more of this, clarify points, explain concepts that I might have skimmed over. There will be the first of several review sessions at the start of the discussion session on January 11th. It will be at most 10 to 15 minutes. I will record it, but I will do a brief presentation on what we covered this first week, very brief, because the first lecture was not material that we're covering on the test, and I'll also leave it open for questions. So next week, we will be going from geography to climate, talking more depth about some of the features we learned about this week, like the circumpolar current, and talking about how they relate specifically to why Antarctica is so cold, windy, and dry. I'll see y'all next week or in discussion section today. I'm recording this a little bit before then. And whenever you get to it, have a lovely weekend and take care.